We can wait a couple of minutes. Do you want to start now, or?
What's the time?
It's 11:15, but we could.
11:15, we can wait.
Yeah, I say wait a couple of minutes, can't we? I think it's a good idea. See if anybody else, people arrive and things. It's a good idea.
So you're based in London?
Yes, I am. So.
Network also is,
well, yes. Yeah. Well, I have a network in London that I lead, and that's UK institutions. But I also have a.
okay.
We're going to wait 2 minutes till somebody else comes. Yeah, if that's okay. If somebody else comes in.
Okay. Please have a seat. Yeah. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Anas Boulal. I'm from UNESCO, Program Specialist for Higher Education in Arab States. It's my pleasure to welcome you all, those who are present and also those who are following online this session. And I think the topic of this higher education talk is extremely important by trying to imagine scenarios and situations of the higher education in the future. And this is why we have today this higher education talk by inviting Professor, try to find the name, Graeme Atherton. I'm sorry for the pronunciations, and I think it's my pleasure to invite Professor Atherton from London to explain the possibilities of imagining those situations of non-inequality in higher education. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anis. Thank you. So I have this microphone here. Okay. I should collect the clicker from over here as well. Thank you, Anis, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and those who are here and those who are watching online. As Anis said, my name is Graeme Atherton, and I'll be speaking today about inequality and equity in higher education, and asking us to think of possibly imagining a different kind of higher education system and how we can do that kind of imagining. Obviously, we're at the end of the conference nearly now, and we've had a lot of sessions on equitable access and success at the event so far. It's been really heartening to see so much focus on an issue which, as I'll talk about in a moment, is something I've spent all of my career devoted to. But at the end of any conference, we need to try to do something a little bit more different. So it will be a case today of trying to think a little bit differently about higher education, particularly about the opportunities for those who maybe never had the opportunity, or perhaps in the past had the opportunity to access and progress into higher education. I just come from an earlier session where there was talk about disruption and different thinking where higher education is concerned. So in today's talk, we'll consider what the possibilities are for that. Before we get into that, though, we'll talk a little bit about my own journey. So why is it that I have spent most of my life looking at access and equity in higher education? But even as well, why my particular story, it may be actually problematic to a degree when we think about access. Because what we'll think today is about some of the things, what we'll describe later on as heuristics or shortcuts or ways of thinking about higher education that we need to change if we are ever going to have a situation where there's no inequality in higher education. So behind me is a picture of where I actually grew up. This is where I grew up in Blackpool. I come from the UK, and my hometown is a seaside resort where you go on holiday. Where you go, there are fairs, there is a tower, a bit like the Eiffel Tower, but smaller. But this is the kind of council estate in which I grew up in Blackpool. So I come from a background myself where my parents didn't go to higher education. They left school with no qualifications when they were 13 years old. Nobody in my area went to higher education. And these kind of places, high-rise estates across Europe, across the world, are those associated with poverty. And we, again, didn't have any money or any jobs in that area when I was growing up. So I was lucky, and I'll say in a moment, that's kind of a problem in a way when we talk about equity. I was lucky that I was relatively good at school. So I was seen as one of those people who maybe needs to progress to higher education. So I started here, and then when I was 18, I went here. This is Trinity College, Oxford, one of the oldest colleges, Oxford University. And the distance from there to there, from the first slide to the second slide, may well be around 300 miles, but in the mind and the culture, it may well be 3,000 miles, because it's totally different from A to B. And that experience of getting from there to there, and not just the benefits of that experience, but the things of that experience which actually I felt needed to be changed, or motivated me to get into the field of equitable access and success in higher education, and to lead initiatives and work in my own country and other countries across the world for the past 20 years or so. But I guess that journey is something that not many people can make. And as I'll say in a moment, I guess every time we think about access, that is also a kind of a challenge. Because when we think about access and imagine access, sometimes we imagine that what it's about is about those kids who are lucky enough to have some sort of ability, who then go from quite poor backgrounds and then go to these prestigious universities and then go on and do some kind of good thing. But that's only a tiny fraction of what access really needs to be about. It is one of the things that I'll say in a moment, these heuristics, or these kind of accepted ways of thinking about higher education. Because if access is only going to be about that kind of journey, we'll never have the kind of access which allows all those students who have the ability to progress to higher education to do so. It'll just be for those who are picked, like, as we say in the UK, like these diamonds from the rough. But I guess what is the problem we're trying to think about here? We've had a lot of sessions that say about equity at the event so far, and possibly we're at a point where we understand the issue as inequities in higher education across the world. But it's worth reaffirming what it is we really are trying to deal with here. This is a piece of work that I undertook 4 or 5 years ago, and it's what described as our global access map. We looked at all the data we could find where access to higher education by social background was concerned across the world. And what we found was that in 90% of the countries in the world where we had evidence, there was inequality in higher education. And this is our access map. So very few countries, the only countries where there wasn't inequalities, was where we couldn't find data. So what we have is a universal problem that binds us in higher education across the world. What we see here is another example of particular countries in Asia. What we see here is data drawn from the 2010s and the 2000s. We see for this selection of countries, what's actually happened, doesn't come through so well there, is that for many countries, the gap, while more students have gone into higher education from lower attainment backgrounds, the gap between those students and the average is getting bigger. So we see the problem in Asia, and even when we see the problem in Europe, where we see more well-developed and older systems, and we think, okay, in Europe, these are mature systems, and even in those countries in Europe where we associate with higher relative levels of equality, we still have huge gaps. And we still see the relationship between the parents of those with higher attainment. It means if you have higher educational attainment as a parent, you're far more likely that your child will go on to higher education. I think as Jamil Salmi said in his presentation only 2 days ago, the best way of guaranteeing your future is choosing the right kind of parents. So we are dealing with an issue which binds us across our fields across the world. And it's worth re-emphasising that before we get into how we can think about the different kind of system we need to imagine. But there are examples of progress. Through our work in World Access to Education Day, and for the work I've been lucky enough to see, we see examples across the world of countries and universities that have taken on the mantle where widening access and equitable access to education is concerned. So an example here in Austria, where they have their own inclusive access and widening participation strategy, a national strategy to address access and inequalities in higher education. We see here, example, University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Scotland have recently produced some data which shows they are approaching a situation where the bottom 20% of the population in terms of socio-economic background, 20% of those are actually going to higher education. It's actually making progress in Scotland where access and success in higher education is concerned. So we see examples of progress, examples of places where universities and countries are really committing to this agenda. However, the overall picture resembles something like this. This is the picture across the world where the commitments to and the actual progress in equity is concerned. Darkness with some specks of light. Your Edinburghs, your Austrias, you see them as specks of light, stars in the darkness. In the murky picture, we're looking at little stars across the world. That is the overall picture, I'm afraid, where we think about access and success in higher education. But what is it that we need to do if we are going to try and think differently about imagining higher education? I guess one thing to think about is to take a step back from this picture of equity in higher education is concerned and consider how we think about making decisions in our lives. And to do this, I'm going to draw upon something outside of the equity space for a moment. Many of you might have heard of a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by a Nobel laureate called Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman's book analysed the way in which we think about decisions. And he divided thought processes into two parts. He described it as System 1 thinking and System 2 thinking. Okay? What he said was that most of our decisions, 90% of our decisions, are made by System 1 thinking. There's the automatic decisions we make on a daily basis. We don't have the time to think logically and with effort about every decision we make. We make them automatically. This System 1 thinking is what dominates our behaviour. If we think there's going to be, it looks gloomy outside of our hotel, never in Barcelona, then we consider taking an umbrella. Automatic decision. What we generally don't do is assess in detail the probability of rain today, every single hour. System 1 thinking. When we see something in front of us, when we see a particular person, an individual, we make a judgment about the kind of person they are or the kind of thing they do. Because it's System 1 thinking, automatic kind of thinking. And we think maybe we're immune from this in higher education because we're reflectors in higher education and our world is that thought. But of course we're not. So an example here, we make quick judgments based on mental prototypes. What does that picture tell us here? What do we think automatically when we see this person here on the left? He's got the tattoos, he's got the tear stain, sign he's murdered somebody apparently, he's got the convict clothes on, criminal. System 1 thinking. Not a student. This System 1 thinking, okay, is this quick, rapid thinking, is what shapes our thoughts. And it's a similar situation in higher education. And it's this System 1 thinking which we need to think about, we consider how we can adapt and change and address if we're ever going to imagine a different kind of higher education system. Because one of our challenges, we haven't imagined yet what we want to see. Because we're constrained by these decisions and thoughts in our System 1 mind about higher education. So let's consider what that means when we get to our actual imagining bit. Okay. When we think about a university, not just us in higher education, but as I'll say later on in the talk today, we have to think about those outside of academia. This is a university. If I ask somebody to think a picture, what's that, a university? Universities can be different sizes and shapes. System 1 thinking, that's a university. Okay. Top universities, what are the top universities? Oxford, California, Harvard, Stanford, they're the top universities. System 1 thinking. I've been in numerous sessions across the last 2 or 3 days. We spoke at world-class universities. What's a world-class university? Top of the rankings list. Automatically, that's what we think. This kind of concept, this kind of thinking, if we're going to have a more equitable future, if we're going to imagine a situation where we have equity in higher education, then it's these system one thinking parts of the system that we need to consider more carefully. What's the top university? What is a university itself? Who runs a university? This is an article from the Times Higher. Many of you will know it's a UK-based publication, but global publication as well. It's an article about, for the first time recently, a university head has come not from a prestigious academic background, not with a raft of publications, but from an administration background. Again, the reason why university leaders come from academic backgrounds, yes, they're best qualified to do so, but it's an automatic thought. Yes, who's the next leader? Person with good publication record. I'm not accepting that it's a system two thing, and that we've considered in detail who the leaders should be. We've decided before we go, they're going to be academics. Because all fields are system one processes, and these are the ones that we deal with in higher education. Okay? And in where we think about access, particularly about equity and access, we start thinking about some of the system one ideas that we have and we need to try and reimagine. So for instance, this is an article only from this week, again, from the UK. The education minister in the UK has rejected the idea that Oxford and Cambridge should consider in their admission systems the social background of the students before they enter. They rejected the idea that possibly because one student goes to a fee-paying school, or one student goes to a non-fee-paying school, or comes from a particular area where the school has more challenges, but when it comes to assessing their marks on entry, we should assess them all the same, because that's what fair means. And actually, it's also saying it's the responsibility of the schools to drive access to higher education. And that is another part of our system one thinking where equity is concerned. Another example, it's the school's responsibility. It's not the higher education responsibility. Problems start in terms of inequities in the school system, and indeed they do. Therefore, it's the school's responsibility. So we have these forms of system one thinking. But the question is, how can we overcome this kind of thinking? And how can we reimagine a different kind of higher education system? So what I'd like to do now, before we go on to the next slide, is each of you consider what you think a more equitable higher education system looks like. Reimagine now the system for you. All those who are doing something different than talking to me, stop doing something different and think about a different kind of system. And I'll ask you what that system looks like. I'll give you 30 seconds for a different kind of system, then we'll ask you. Okay? Some audience interaction. Okay? I won't ask you because you're busy doing something else, a lot of you, but think about a different kind of system. So we can reimagine that system beyond our kind of system one thinking. We position that in our mind as that different kind of system, because until we imagine something that's different, we won't achieve that different kind of goal. It has to be a different system in your own particular context. Okay. And finally, I guess, in our system thinking, is what does a student look like? When one looks for images of students, we call it this kind of group of people. Characteristic of them, what's a student look like? They look like this group. Predominantly, on the internet, they're seen as white. Of course, this isn't the case. Most students across the world are not white. And they're also seen as young. When we know if we're going to have an equitable access system, we need older learners, progressing through lifelong learning. So these kind of thoughts, these kind of automatic thoughts, are what constrain us in imagining a different kind of system. Imagining, however, is only part of the battle. So you've all been there, you've imagined your different kind of system. What could that look like? It'll be different for your own particular context. Will it be a system where all students from poor backgrounds can enter and succeed? Will it be a system where those who have different ethnic backgrounds can succeed and imagine? There is no inequality in that sense. Will it be a system where those small gender backgrounds can progress and succeed? What will that vision look like for you? Till we imagine that different kind of system, we won't be able to achieve it. Okay. However, in terms of making that imagination come forth, you may come back to me and say, it's okay imagining a system. It's always sitting here and thinking of a different kind of system. It's okay in recognizing these shortcuts, these heuristics, as Kahneman describes them. Heuristics being shortcut ways of thinking. But in the real world, in the real politics of higher education, in the political side of higher education, how can we actually overcome some of this thinking? How can things really change? Well, in order to understand that it is possible to overcome these heuristics, to shift things, or things have shifted, it's worthwhile going back a bit and thinking not about higher education, but thinking about schools. This picture here is a picture of the mean years of schooling from 1900 across the world. What it shows us is that for the majority of countries, the mean year of schooling was around 3 to 6 years. Okay. And if we cast our minds back 100 years, the debates that we're having at the moment about how many students should go to higher education, what access should look like, we're constrained to a degree by this system one thinking, these automatic thoughts about what higher education is. But some of the similar thoughts and discussions that were going on 100 years ago where schooling was concerned. If you were to look back in your own particular countries at the debates around schooling that happened in the early part of the 20th century, I would guess you would find discussions where some would argue that there's no need for young people to have schooling beyond the age of 12 or 13. Certainly in the UK, when there were debates on expanding the schooling age, there were quite vigorous debates in the Houses of Parliament in the UK about whether it was appropriate for children to be schooled beyond 12, 13 or 14. This is the mean years of schooling from 2010, over 100 years later. As you will see, on average, years in schooling has dramatically increased. That's not to say there aren't huge issues, where parts of the world there are millions of children who do not complete school, who leave school at 11 and 12, etc., who don't complete full secondary schooling. Absolutely. Yet overall, there has been a seismic shift over 100 years in the amount of education young people receive. So things have and do change. The kind of system one thinking that dominated the world of schooling in the early part of the 20th century, that system one thinking was children have to leave school at 12 or 13. We need them to work, and in particular, we need to work. That's why they need to leave, they need to work. That changed. It shifted to here. So change is feasible and possible. Reimagining, which is what's happening, reimagining what amount of schooling there should be, is conceivable. However, of course, in learning from the past, what we also see here, is that schooling is profoundly unequal. So while we have had more people at school, as we've mentioned before, where you come from, what your parents do, your parents' level of income, very much dictates how well you do at school. And this graph shows the difference between non-professionals and professionals and their children's average reading scores. Because all these European countries, the reading scores of professional children are better than non-professional children. So while we reimagine schooling, we didn't reimagine inequality in schooling. So that brings us back to where we are in higher education in the early part of the 21st century. We have opportunity now to reimagine and learn from the past. Because I'd also predict that these discussions we're having about who should go to higher education, how many should go to higher education, if we go forward, UNESCO has their annual conference in 80, 90 years' time, very few of us will be here, I imagine. Most of us won't be, but none of us will be, I would imagine. The debates we're having about participation may look somewhat quaint at that time. A little like when we think back and look at these debates around schooling, that kind of system one thinking about schooling that happened in the early part of the 20th century looks to us in the past a little bit quaint. How could those debates be happening? So change, therefore, in imagining what kind of system you want is conceivable. But to do it, as I said before, you have to have that thought. We cannot have that system until we've imagined what that kind of system could be. Which is why the exercise before is so important. You have to come out of this conference thinking about the kind of system you want to have and thinking about what we've learned from the past. It won't happen unless we think it. So, okay, we've thought about the past, but what now about the present? What kind of things would we need to do now, both for those inside and outside higher education, if we are going to move that kind of system one thinking, learn from the past, and develop that kind of equitable education system that we have in our heads already? Today you've all imagined it for me in this session. Okay. Well, what do we learn back from Kahneman? Firstly, we have to think about how we frame higher education. Kahneman's work suggests it's much more powerful when we talk about things that people may lose if they don't make a decision, as opposed to what they will gain. So perhaps we need to start thinking about presenting the losses, the damage done by not having an equitable system, as opposed to also its benefits. What is the damage? What is the loss that's made to policymakers, to education leaders and others by not pursuing this reimagined equitable system? Okay. Data. How can we provide evidence? What evidence shifts system one thinking? So we've talked about framing the position. Will that move our system one thinking? Will that move the biases? The heuristics we discussed before. Often some of these heuristics, these shortcut ways of thinking, are based around what we've already seen, what we already know, our experience. Data may disrupt this. This is an example here from the other piece of work I described earlier on, our global access map we did 5 years ago. We looked at equity data charter. We outlined what governments and higher education providers should do to collect data and information. Looked at our map earlier on, we would also find that very few of our universities and countries actually collect systematic data on who participates in higher education by social background. We haven't conceived of the problem, but we can imagine what system would fix it. So data, a way of possibly disrupting our system one thinking. What's this? Okay, this is a screenshot from a breakfast news program in the States. In the UK, sorry. This is Heart Radio, okay? This is the most popular morning radio station, apparently, in the UK. It plays kind of 80s and 90s songs by Queen and other sorts of popular artists, okay? The reason I'm showing this is because Heart reaches far more people than, say, Radio 4 in the UK, where there's intellectual debate around issues of policy and equity. When I speak to my colleagues in politics, they say, basically, if you want to reach the public, you need to consider how Heart Breakfast are going to cover your story in their 3-minute news bulletin. Because that 3-minute news bulletin will reach far more people than anything you write in The Guardian or The Times Higher or anything else you may put in your professional press. If you want to disrupt system one thinking about higher education, disrupt policymakers, get them to come round to some of the things we all believe and we've talked about in our sessions, How do we get these messages into the 3-minute breakfast messages in the 3-minute news bulletin in Heart Breakfast? And I would hypothesize that all the countries that you have a similar radio program that comes out in the morning, that talks to celebrities, that has people bringing it up and phoning in, and plays music from the past that people like to listen to. If you're going to disrupt the System 1 thinking of those outside of higher education, what messages about higher education will reach those people through things like Heart Breakfast Radio? We also, if we're going to disrupt System 1 thinking, though, have to do it in a sensitive way. Because particularly in some of the countries that I live in, that we work in, those outside of higher education, those who haven't accessed higher education, can feel left out. And that has built some kind of resentment which politicians have played upon. Certainly for working class males in countries such as the UK, the US, and others, they don't fare well where higher education is concerned. And if we're going to disrupt the System 1 thinking about higher education, we need to think how we do it in a sensitive way, so that we do not alienate some of those who aren't in higher education, and don't make those who aren't in higher education feel they're less worthy, and their jobs are less worthy, their lives are less worthy than those who are in higher education. Imagining a higher education system without inequality does not mean imagining a higher education system where those who will not be in it feel that they are left out or feel they're less worthy because they are not in it. So that disruption has to be done in a sensitive way. Otherwise, we won't achieve that movement of imagination which requires policymakers as much as those in higher education. Because policymakers think differently about higher education, what it is and what it can be. We also need to collaborate and join together. Yesterday, we launched the World Access to Education Network, the first global network that actually looks focused specifically on equitable access and success in higher education. It's not the only route of collaboration, but if we're going to shift this System 1 thinking, we have to do it by working and collaborating together, internationally, where equity and access is concerned, via YNFE or via through many of the other excellent and important organisations represented in this conference who aren't here as well, nationally and internationally. Okay. So finally, this is a projection of the numbers of post-secondary students by the end of the century. This projection predicts there'll be far more post-secondary students by 2100 than there are by 2020. However, who will those students be? Will they be those from the backgrounds like me and like others who never expected to get to higher education? Will they continually be dominated by those who do have the chances to go to HE? And have we imagined a situation now where we can shape what that looks like? I'll finish with one final slide. This, if you do not know, I took a picture of last night in Barcelona's dock. There are two of these statues called the Mirastelas, the Stargazer, by Robert Limos, in the port at the end of the Rambla. Okay? These two, the Stargazer is there to remind us to look out into the future. And also the Stargazer is there to remind us that whatever happens, we need to be resilient. So my final thought about imagination in the higher education system is we need to look into the stars like the Versailles is and look at what kind of system do we want, but we're resilient when we do so. The reason the statue is built that way is it topples and it goes away it topples and moves in the ways, but it doesn't fall over because it's resilient. That's what we need to be if we're going to disrupt our System 1 thinking. Like the Stargazer, imagine a higher education world where there is no inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Atherton, for this journey taking us from from the past to the present, and having insights in the future of access to higher education. And I think by listening to your speech, you argued that we will have to contribute to making higher education more equal, or we will face the consequences. What are those consequences? What do you mean? Could you please elaborate on those consequences?
Well, I guess one of the consequences we can think of is the relevance of higher education. We consider ourselves, we talk in our sessions about why higher education is possibly not more engaged in certain broader questions with regards to global challenges, inequality and sustainable development, etc. However, if we continue to have a global system where we only ever accept into our universities a minority of the population, then how can we expect to be relevant to the majority of the world's problems? We see there that, again, the prediction is there'll be expansion of post-secondary education, expansion of education over the course of the century. It doesn't say what kind of education that may be. And when I look to the past and I pointed out the growth in schooling over the past 100 years, it doesn't necessarily mean that the growth in higher education will come in the way we expect it to be in the next 100 years. The risk is that if we are not engaged, we can engage in these questions of inequality and engage in them, but until we actually have a situation where those participating as students in our system are drawn from across populations, and we commit to those things, then how can we claim to be relevant to these problems? We can do research on these things, that's great, we can write papers, we can have profound books, but at the end of the day, the people on that slide, the people where I come from, it's not relevant to them. It's not relevant to them. And it's not just where I come from. I can go out there and in an hour, I'll find you at a estate in Barcelona and ask them about education. It won't mean anything to them.
Thank you so much. I think we still have time for taking some questions. If any questions, please.
That's a question. I think it's a question over there.
Sorry, I can't see from. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, and thank you very much for your interesting speech. And a suggestion and a short comment. I have the impression, not only the impression, because we have a lot of social research about these new inequalities and new asymmetries. During these last decades, we assisted to the great narration that the so-called digital revolution will define a new condition of emancipation and of equality. The problem is not the digital revolution, that is an opportunity. But I think that the majority of our educational policies start from this misunderstanding that digital revolution produces simplification and produce emancipation. And I really hope that we can keep in contact in the future. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to respond to that comment? Yeah, no, I think on the digital point, I think where access and success and inequality is concerned, I think as the gentleman was commenting, we have to be guarded that this will not create new forms of inequality, where we see those who have the ability will have a face-to-face learning experience, and those with less resources will have an online learning experience, and those experiences will not be of comparable quality. And I think also what the pandemic has brought home to us is the gaps in access to digital resources in different ways. And it's not just a matter of having digital access, it's having the skills, it's having the appropriate context in the home in which one can learn. And I think we've seen across countries these differences in digital capabilities and competencies and infrastructure. Those are ones that I think will need to be addressed if ever we're going to harness the ability of digitization to affect access and success.
Thank you. More question, please. Yeah, while talking about the access, do you think that this is the solution?
Digitization?
Yes.
I think certainly there's a potential of digitization to reach more learners, and while in imagining a scenario where there's less or no inequality in higher education, then we have to be open to the possibilities of change. And I think we're not likely to see the kind of changes in the systems that we want to see unless we're open to these new possibilities. I think that was really the theme of my speech in some ways. So I think there is potential digitization, but it would have to be developed in a very particular way. I think, again, in a way where those communities and countries where digitization can be really important in terms of extending access, in those countries, they're part of that process. So we don't see a model where we see perhaps particular parts of the world developing digital forms of education for other parts of the world, and that part of the world possibly not being brought into that process. And I think it has to go hand in hand as well with the kind of infrastructural investments which are required if indeed those populations are able to access digital learning. I think also there is ways of combining digital and physical learning which can be very innovative as well. Well, there's examples of them, I think, already. So we do have those examples of good practice, I think.
Yeah, sometimes we see a solution for better higher education. It's not only the access, but I think it's more quality-oriented. So I think the access is not solving all the problems, and I think we need more quality higher education system. But exactly. If you see, so, and I think this is the equation between okay, is it enough to have people accessing this higher education systems, or because also we see different regions in the world that after graduation they have no employment possibilities after that. So what's behind the access just to be graduated but not working?
No, indeed. I mean, success is that's why we describe our work as equitable access and success, because we know that success is crucial. I mean, if you look at some of the data we have as well, that we have actually seen in the last 10 to 20 years and the evidence available, some progress in some parts of the world where access is concerned, but less progress in terms of completion. And I think possibly this is where we approach these difficult questions, because while we want to see, imagine a world where there is less inequality in higher education in terms of participation, we also want there to be a labour market that is adjusted to that situation. So this is where we have to have coherent policies, where we think about how employers are prepared to actually take on and employ those with different levels of skills. Sometimes we talk a lot about graduate employment being an issue for graduates themselves, and perhaps they're emerging from higher education without the kind of skills and competencies required by the labour market. Policymakers need to think about how the labour markets are there adjusted to move to more high-skill scenarios. They're indeed going to maximise the potential of their populations.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Good morning. Just a question regarding this inequality. Sometimes, or I would say it's more and more frequent, young people is never more considering higher education as an interesting option to have a career. So sometimes inequality is also attached or linked to the expectations of young people regarding the amount of options that away from university they have through internet. Many apps or platforms that help finding jobs or developing their own projects or entrepreneurship. So the access to university is also a problem of how the university is adapted to the real world. And I think it's not only a question of those young people that want but cannot access the university for different reasons, but also these young people that do not want to access university just because it's not offering what real world really offers. Maybe some decades ago that was not the case, but today it's more and more frequent. So how should the university face also this problem, which is inside the university more than in real world?
Yes, no, I think it's an excellent question. I think one of the things that we've talked a lot through the conference is the fact that cultures and structures within higher education institutions appear to change only slowly. And I think one of the disruptive forces we need to think about is how we introduce the rapidity of change. As organisations, universities are based around certain models of internal consultation and debate, which, of course, are very intrinsic to the character of higher education. Part also that system one thinking about higher education is. But the consequences of those forms of systems are that change is slow. So we look at other kinds of organisations, they're able to move much more rapidly in the face of some of the challenges you're discussing, where they see those wishing to enter, those they're serving, with different sets of needs. So it's a structural system for universities, but it requires, again, that thoughts about what kind of systems govern universities internally. And that, again, will require leadership, will require those as leaders who are willing to move away from traditional systems. And also, when doing so, risk those in higher education who will be opposed to that. They will see some of these deliberative systems as superior and intrinsic to what they do. But they are things that will need to change if we are indeed going to be responsive and adaptive to a world that is changing much quicker than universities are at the moment, many of them anyway. Not all, of course. They're different, very vastly different sorts of institutions, so we shouldn't branch them all in this way, but many are able to do so.
Okay, our time is over.
Thank you.
Professor Atherton, thank you so much for this inspired discussion, and thank you all for your participation, and have a nice day. Thank you so much.